It is no light thing, I have found, to be roused from the small comforts of routine into the sharp air of the inexplicable. Yet it was upon such a morning, one of those gray London mornings which seem brewed from soot and river mist, when the very lamps look weary of their own illumination, that I first became acquainted with the singular circumstance which I have ventured to entitle. A letter arrived at Baker Street. Written in Holmes's handwriting, I had been some weeks returned from the Continent, where a minor surgical engagement had carried me into the Ardennes, and I confess that my spirits, though improved by travel, were still susceptible to those sudden shadows which so often attend a man who has once looked too closely upon war and human frailty. Baker Street, therefore, with its familiar odor of tobacco, leather bindings, I had the faint chemical tang which clung to my companion like an aura, came upon me with the homely relief of a port after unsettled seas. Holmes was in one of his quieter phases. Those who know him only by popular report imagine him forever in a fever of pursuit, darting through fog-bound alleys, pouncing upon villains and hurling epigrams like javelins at the duller intellects of Scotland Yard. In truth, his alternations were as regular as the tides, long stretches of languor and abstraction, during which he lay upon the sofa with half-lidded eyes and fingers steepled, punctuated by sudden explosions of energy when the world at last presented him with a problem worthy of his powers. On the morning in question, he was seated in his dressing-gown by the window, violin within reach, the morning paper unheeded upon his knee. A thin line of sunlight, watery and hesitant, had contrived to pierce the curtain and fell across his sharp cheekbone like a blade. He did not turn as I entered, yet his voice came at once, calm, precise, and faintly amused. "You have been in Belgium?" I had not yet removed my gloves. "Indeed, Holmes," said I, smiling in spite of myself. "If you begin again with these conjuring tricks, I shall be forced to believe you have bribed the station-master." He glanced up then, and in that quick, bird-like motion of his eye saw that his mind, however languid his posture, was already alive to every minute detail. "Your left boot bears a smear of pale clay," said he, "of a texture common to the low country outside Liège, but not to the Ardennes proper. Your coat has the faint odor of cigar smoke, not English, not French either, the heavy, sweet tobacco favored in Ostend. And you have, despite your efforts at concealment, a small bruise upon the second finger of the right hand, as one acquires when a man has been packing surgical instruments in haste into a case too shallow. Belgium, my dear Watson, by way of Ostend, and likely with no small irritation." "My irritation," said I, laughing outright, "is now wholly transferred to you. There is no privacy in London so long as you exist within it." "Privacy is an illusion," he returned, with that cold gentleness which sat oddly upon his angular features. "It is merely the name which the careless give to their own inattention." He might have pursued this philosophical thread, but Mrs. Hudson's step was already upon the stair, accompanied by the rustle of something stiff and papered. She entered, as she always did, with an apologetic air, as though disturbing us were a moral failing for which she must atone. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes. It were pushed through the letter-box not 5 minutes ago, and no one rang." Holmes held out his hand without rising, and Mrs. Hudson placed it upon his palm as one might place a snake. I saw at once that she, too, felt something unusual in the mere presence of it. The envelope was of thick, expensive cream paper, the sort which announces money and caution in its very grain. There was no stamp, no postmark, no indication that it had traveled any distance at all. It had been delivered by hand quietly and with intent. Upon the front, in a bold, familiar script, were written only 2 words: "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," not the address, not Baker Street, not even London. Just his name, as though the writer could conceive of no other Holmes in the world, and no other door through which a letter for him might pass. I leaned forward, Odd, said, I know seal, no crest, no address. Whoever wrote it trusts to your reputation rather than the post office. Holmes did not answer. He had turned the envelope over. What arrested his gaze was not the paper nor the method of delivery, but the handwriting itself. I saw his nostrils flare slightly as a man's may when he catches the scent of something sharp and unexpected. Well? I asked. His eyes flickered to mine, and for an instant the mask slipped. I caught a glimpse not of surprise, for Holmes was not easily surprised, but of something rarer, displeasure, touched with a kind of wary interest. It is my handwriting, said he. I stared. Your handwriting. Nonsense. He extended the envelope towards me. Look. I took it and examined it under the light. The letters were formed with that decisive economy I knew so well, upright, slightly compressed with the peculiar angularity of the K and the long, confident cross of the T which I had seen 100 times upon his monographs and notes. It is remarkably like, I admitted. An imitation, then. Holmes's mouth tightened. Not merely like. Exact within the limits of a pen and paper. You mean a forgery so perfect that it ceases to be a forgery. He finished quietly and becomes something else. He took the envelope back and held it close to the lamp, tilting it so that the light raked across the surface. His long fingers moved with delicate precision, tracing the indentations of the pen strokes as though reading Braille. The pressure is mine, he murmured. The rhythm is mine. The hesitation before the H mine. There is even, he paused, and a small, mirthless sound escaped him. There is even the faint blot at the tail of the S. I have made that blot often, too often. A chill stole through me, and I found my gaze drifting to the letterbox slit in the front door, as though I expected to see an eye pressed to it. Who would dare? I began. Holmes slipped a thin knife beneath the flap and opened the envelope with the care of a man disarming a trap. From within he drew a single sheet of paper, folded once. No scent escaped it, no powder fell. Yet the manner of his handling told me he expected danger none the less. He unfolded it. At the first glance he stiffened. What is it? He demanded. He did not answer. His eyes moved across the page with extraordinary speed, and then, most unsettling of all, he read it again, slowly, as if each word had acquired a new weight. Only then did he lay it upon the table between us. Read, said he. I obeyed. The handwriting within was the same as upon the envelope, his own, and the words, God help me, were worse than the hand. My dear Watson, if you are reading this, I have done something unforgivable. Do not trust me, even if I beg it of you. The man you think you know will, within 3 days, bring ruin upon an innocent house. Hold unless you stop him. Go at once to the house of Mr. Julian Vane, 13 Ainsley Gardens, Kensington, and do not speak my name there. Ask instead for the music room. You will be shown something which you must not allow into my hands. If I come with you, lie to me. If I go alone, follow me. If I do not go at all, be certain I have already been there. Above all, do not permit Inspector Lestrade to see this letter. He will do precisely what the writer intends. You will think this is madness. It is not. It is method. For some seconds I could do no more than stare at the paper, as though the very letters might shift and explain themselves if watched intently enough. When at last I looked up, Holmes was regarding me with an expression of such controlled stillness that it was almost inhuman. Well, said he, it is. My mouth was dry. It is in your hand. It is signed with your initials. It addresses me in a manner you would use. And yet, it is impossible, he said softly. What does it mean? It means, said Holmes, and his voice had become very quiet indeed, that someone wishes you to believe I am capable of treachery. You are incapable of it." Holmes's eyes narrowed not at me, but at the invisible mind behind the letter. "Am I?" said he. "You have known me many years, Watson. You have trusted me with your life. But have you ever considered how easily trust may be engineered? How often a man believes he is acting freely when in truth his choices have been arranged like pieces upon a board. You speak as if you were." I hesitated, searching for the word, hating it as I found it. "As if you were afraid." Holmes smiled then, but it was a smile with no warmth in it. "My dear fellow," said he, "I am afraid only of boredom." "But I am." He paused, and his fingers tapped once upon the paper. "Interested, very interested." He rose at last, and at once the languor dropped from him like a discarded coat. The man before me became the Holmes of action, lean, alert, and possessed of that fierce inward concentration which made him seem less a person than a force. 3 days, he murmured. A named address, restriction concerning Lestrade. A phrase, the music room. And, most delightful of all, the writer presumes to instruct you to lie to me. "It is outrageous," I cried. "It is precise," said he. "Outrage is emotional. Precision is intellectual. This letter is not meant merely to alarm you, Watson. It is meant to set you in motion along a path chosen for you. Then we must refuse to follow it." He shook his head. "Refusal is itself a move on the board. The writer expects obedience. He is prepared for disobedience. He expects disobedience. He is prepared for obedience. The question is not whether we follow, but whether we can discover the purpose of the path." I bent again over the page, compelled despite myself. "It says you will within 3 days bring ruin upon an innocent household." A household named Holmes reminded me. Julian Vane. Ainsley Gardens, you know the name. Holmes's. Eyes flickered. "I know of him. A man of means. A collector. A patron of the arts in a small, self-advertising way. Not a criminal. Not at least publicly a man with enemies who deliver unstamped letters through the fog. And why would anyone draw you into his affairs?" Holmes lifted his violin from the chair and balanced it lightly in one hand, as if the familiar instrument steadied his thoughts. "Because," said he, "Mr. Vane possesses something of sufficient value that the writer believes it will attract me more than it will destroy me. And the letter suggests you have already been there, or will go alone." Holmes's gaze sharpened, which implies surveillance. "Someone observes my movements, anticipates my habits, and has confidence in their ability to predict my curiosity." He crossed to the hearth and stood with his back to the fire, the violin held like a baton. The room seemed suddenly smaller, the air heavier. "Watson," said he, "tell me what you see." I blinked, startled by the abruptness. "The letter? The handwriting? The threat?" "No, look beyond the obvious. What is the most singular feature of this communication?" I considered. "It is written in your hand. Common enough among forgers. It is delivered without post. Common enough among the bold. It warns me not to trust you. Dramatic, yes, but not singular." I shook my head, frustrated. Holmes's eyes, bright as a hawk's, did not leave my face. At last it came to me not as a deduction, but as the recognition of an absurdity. "It is addressed to me," I said slowly, "yet it comes to you." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. The writer wishes you to read it, but ensures it must pass through my hands first." I felt my skin prickle. "Then it is a test." "A test," said Holmes, "or a trap. Either it is meant to separate us, or it is meant to prove that we cannot be separated. And Lestrade—" Holmes's lip curled. "Lestrade is a convenient instrument, sharp enough to cut, dull enough to wield without thinking. Whoever wrote this letter knows how Scotland Yard responds to scandal, to apparent betrayal, to the suggestion that Sherlock Holmes has overstepped some boundary. They want Lestrade to behave predictably. You suspect blackmail. A frame. I suspect, said Holmes, a mind that has studied me. A mind with access to my handwriting nor to the means of reproducing it. A mind that understands not only what I do, but what I am believed to do. He stepped to the table again and examined the paper with renewed intensity. There is more, he said, half to himself. The paper is of a particular manufacture ag content. High water mark, faint. The Inkiern Gall, but not the brand I favor. The fold is wrong. I fold my letters inward first, not outward. The writer imitates my hand, but not my habits. Suggests what? That they have seen my writing, said Holmes, but not observed me closely in person. Or else they have observed me, yet assume that penmanship is identity. He looked at me then with sudden force. What's and how many people possess samples of my hand? I have seen it, of course. Lestrade, too obvious and too clumsy. My brother has it. Mrs. Hudson has seen notes. The landlady at Montague Street once received a written instruction in my name during Aunt Moriarty. I said, and immediately regretted the word, for it had the effect of casting a shadow across Holmes's expression. Moriarty is dead, said Holmes flatly. Let us not revive him simply because our nerves seek a familiar spectre. Yet even as he spoke, I saw that the name had struck some chord, whether of memory or caution, I could not tell. At that instant the street door below opened and shut, and a step sounded upon the stair heavier than Mrs. Hudson's, brisker, official. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. There is a particular tempo to the tread of a man. He believes he carries news and expects gratitude for bearing it. Inspector Lestrade entered without ceremony, his hat in hand, his thin face pinched by the cold and by that perpetual sense of being surrounded by puzzles which offended his vanity. Morning, Holmes. Morning, Doctor. His eyes moved about the room, missed nothing obvious, and therefore noticed nothing subtle. Got a bit of business come in? Thought of you at once. Holmes's gaze drifted, with maddening calm, to the letter upon the table. I felt my heart give an unpleasant lurch. The letter had warned me above all. Do not permit Inspector Lestrade to see this letter, and here he was, in our rooms, his eyes already narrowing with curiosity. Holmes, however, did not so much as glance at the paper. He returned Lestrade's look with indolent politeness. Your faith in my utility continues to touch me, said he. To what do we owe the honor? Lestrade tossed a folded sheet of official paper onto the table so close to the incriminating letter that my hand twitched instinctively as though to cover it. A queer little affair in Kensington, said Lestrade. A gentleman named Julian Vane lives at Ainsley Gardens. Says he's had something stolen, something of uncommon value on the way it was done. Well, it's got a touch of the theatrical. Figured it might amuse you. The room seemed, for a moment, to tilt. Holmes's eyes, those cold, bright engines, lifted slowly to Lestrade. Indeed, said he. How very interesting. And then, as his fingers drifted almost casually over the two sheets upon the table, I saw him do the smallest thing. He slid the mysterious letter an inch beneath the morning paper, hiding it as neatly as a magician palms a coin. His face remained expressionless. Only I, who knew him, could perceive the sudden tightening at the corners of his mouth. Lestrade continued, unaware that he had stepped into a design already in motion. It's a blasted odd one, said he. Vane's in a fright. Says the thief left a message, not printed, not cut from papers, written. Holmes's voice was as smooth as ever. Aye, said Lestrade, and the damnedest part is, it's written in your hand, Holmes. I heard, very distinctly, the soft tick of the clock upon the mantel, as though time itself had paused to listen. Holmes's eyes met mine for the briefest instant, no more than a flicker yet in it. I read the whole situation. The trap was not being prepared. It was already sprung. Then, said Holmes, turning back to Lestrade with the ghost of a smile, "It appears, Inspector, that I have been thinking of myself as well." Holmes waited until Lestrade had settled himself awkwardly, as a man always does in rooms where he is not master before. He leaned back in his chair and regarded our visitor with a languid attention that deceived no one who knew him. The inspector, warming his thin hands at the fire, launched into his account with that mixture of importance and irritation which was his habitual manner when confronted by anything he could not immediately reduce to a common felony. Mr. Julian Vane, it appeared, was a widower of independent fortune with a taste for rare curiosities and a private passion for music. He had returned from his club shortly after midnight, dismissed his servants, and spent an hour alone in his music-room apartment at the rear of the house where he kept, besides a formidable library of scores, a glass-fronted cabinet containing certain objects he would not entrust to any bank. At some hour between 1 and 2 o'clock he had rung violently for his butler. When the man arrived, he found his employer pale, trembling, and pointing to the cabinet. The lock had not been forced, the doors were intact, and yet a small morocco, case no larger than a man's hand, had vanished from within. Upon the shelf, propped neatly against a folio of Handel, lay a sheet of paper bearing a single sentence: "I take only what was promised." Below, it was the signature's H hand, Lestrade insisted. The whole thing written in a hand so like Holmes's that Vane had at once concluded the consulting detective was either in some private arrangement with the thief, or was himself the thief. Holmes listened without a change of countenance, but I, whose eyes had strayed more than once to the hidden letter beneath the newspaper, felt as though the very air in the room had been thickened by some invisible gas. When Lestrade finished, he produced the note in question, sealed in an evidence envelope, and laid it upon the table with a little smack of triumph. Holmes did not touch it. Instead, he asked, in a tone of mild curiosity, whether Mr. Vane had any enemies, any recent quarrels, any dismissed servants, any gambling debts, any reason at all beyond his own vanity to suppose himself the center of a criminal plot. "He says no," Lestrade replied. "But he's the sort who'd rather choke than admit to being a fool. And the servants? Clean as whistles. Far as I can see, no forced entry. Windows fastened. Door bolts shut. It's as if the thing walked out on its own legs." Holmes's eyelids drooped. "A useful miracle," said he. "And what does Mr. Vane claim was in this morocco case?" Lestrade hesitated, and I saw the first sign of embarrassment cross his sharp features. "He wouldn't tell me," he said. "Said it were a private matter. Said he'd tell you." "How flattering," murmured Holmes. "Then he has asked for me." "He demanded you," said Lestrade shortly. "He's an influential man, Holmes. He's talking about the papers." And the inspector's eyes narrowed. "He's talking about charges." Holmes at last leaned forward and took the evidence envelope between finger and thumb, as if it were something distasteful, yet instructive. He studied the writing through the paper without opening it, then returned it to the table. "A competent imitation," said he. "But an imitation nonetheless." Lestrade sniffed. "You'd say that?" "Naturally," replied Holmes. "Truth is so often natural." The inspector's color rose. "You were in Kensington last night," he said abruptly. I felt a shock of astonishment, and yet Holmes only raised his brows. "Was I? A cabman swears he took you from Oxford Street to the vicinity of Ainsley Gardens at 11:30. Holmes's smile was thin. "Then either your cabman is mistaken, or I possess a double with excellent taste in destinations." Lestrade's gaze flicked towards me, seeking alliance in common sense. "Doctor, you were here with him?" I forced my voice to steadiness. "I was not with Mr. Holmes at 11:30, said I, which was true. for I had been abed with a book while Holmes wandered as he pleased, but I heard him return before midnight. Holmes's eyes did not move, yet I felt his attention sharpen upon my phrasing. Lestrade grunted. "Convenient." Holmes rose suddenly, all languor gone. "Inspector," said he, "you may believe me implicated if it comforts you, but do not imagine it will assist your investigation. Bring me to Mr. Vane. Now." Lestrade blinked, taken aback by the decisiveness. "You'll come quietly, then." "My dear fellow," said Holmes, picking up his coat, "I shall come noisily, if it pleases you. With a brass band and a banner. The essential thing is that I shall come." He turned to me. "Watson, you will accompany us." I saw, in that instant, the full cruelty of the letter's instruction. If I come with you, lie to me. If I go alone, follow me. Holmes had chosen the course that forced me to act beside him, under his eye, and yet conceal from him the existence of the warning addressed to my own name. I had faced men with knives and Afghan passes, and felt less strain than I did as I nodded and reached for my hat. In the cab, as we rattled through the morning streets towards Kensington, Lestrade sat opposite, stiff with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has cornered a fox, while Holmes stared out at the blurred shop fronts and dripping railings with the detached air of one watching a play whose plot he already knows. I, meanwhile, watched Holmes's profile and wondered at the unseen hand that could counterfeit not only his writing but his very reputation, turning it into a weapon. Twice I made as if to speak, and twice the words died. For how does one tell a man that he is being hunted by a shadow of himself? When at last the cab drew up before the clean, stuccoed frontage of 13 Ainsley Gardens, and the butler admitted us with frightened civility, I caught, beyond the hall, the faintest thread of sound. A piano note struck softly and held, as if someone in a distant room were testing a string. Holmes's head turned a fraction. His eyes, bright and intent, met mine. "Music room," he said under his breath, and there was no question in its homely recognition, as though the very house had spoken a word he had been expecting all along. The butler, an elderly, slate-faced man with a white tie too carefully arranged for so early an hour, conducted us down a passage hung with family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow our progress with that reproachful fixity peculiar to respectable ancestors. Lestrade walked with the air of one who already heard the iron clang of handcuffs, while Holmes, silent and alert, moved as lightly as a cat, his gaze taking in the scuffed edge of a runner, the faint dusting of plaster beneath a cornice, the smear of something dark upon a door-jamb. We were shown at last into the music room, and there I understood at once why Mr. Vane had chosen the phrase as though it were a password. It was a chamber contrived for comfort and display in equal measure. A polished grand piano stood open, its strings gleaming. Velvet curtains muffled the street. A stand of violins and cases leaned by a mahogany cabinet whose glass front reflected our figures like ghosts. Near the hearth, in a hub-backed chair, sat Julian Vane himself, a handsome man gone slightly to seed thick at the throat, smooth of cheek, his eyes bright with a cultivated nervousness. He rose with a quick, almost theatrical movement and fixed Holmes with an expression in which indignation warred with relief. "Double quotes, Mr. Holmes," said he, "you come at last. Inspector Dr. Pray, observe. I have been robbed in my own house, and insulted besides." Lestrade produced a notebook. "You'll tell Mr. Holmes what you wouldn't tell me, then?" Vane's lips tightened. "I shall tell Mr. Holmes what concerns him," said he, "not what may satisfy the curiosity of Scotland Yard." Holmes inclined his head, as if acknowledging a compliment he had neither sought nor valued. "You have been robbed of a morocco case," said he. "It was taken from yonder cabinet without force. A note was left, written in my hand. You believe?" therefore that I am involved. I believe, cried Vane, that your name has been used in a way which compels explanation. I know nothing of your methods, but I know what I saw. He pointed with a trembling finger to the shelf within. The cabinet, there where the case stood, and there where the note lay. The lock was untouched. The key never left my chain. Holmes moved to the cabinet at once. He did not ask permission, nor did Vane offer it, for in such moments a man of position is glad enough to surrender authority to anyone who appears to possess it. Holmes examined the lock, the hinges, the glass, the shelf, and finally the very floor beneath. Dropping to one knee and peering along the skirting board, as though some infinitesimal trace might betray the truth, I hovered at his shoulder, seeing only varnished wood and well-kept brass, yet feeling that the room had become charged, every object a potential clue. Lestrade, impatient, cleared his throat. Well, tea demanded. Holmes did not answer him. Instead, he rose and crossed to the piano. The lid was raised, the music rest bearing a score Beethoven, I think set open at a page dense with notes. Holmes's fingers, long and sensitive, touched the edge of the keyboard, not striking a sound, merely feeling the surface. And then he bent and sniffed lightly at the wood, as a man might test the bouquet of wine. "You have been playing this morning," said he to Vane. "Ah, yes," stammered the other. "It steadies me. Your left hand," Holmes continued, "has a slight tremor, but only when you speak of the cabinet. Your right does not tremble when you speak of the note. Therefore you fear the theft, but you are more angered than frightened by the insult." Vane colored. "What is that to the point?" "It is always to the point," said Holmes quietly. "Now, you rang for your butler shortly after 1 o'clock. Before that, you were alone in this room. Alone. You did not leave it? No. And yet you did not hear anyone enter. No one entered." Vane snapped, and then, catching himself, forced a laugh. "You see the absurdity. That is why I sent for you. It is impossible." Holmes's eyes flicked to the curtains. "This window looks upon the garden. It's a small private strip. Walled, no one could climb." Holmes had already drawn the curtain aside. A pale winter light spilled in, showing the damp stone of a terrace, and, beyond it, the top of a wall beaded with soot. A thin vine clung there, leafless and black. Holmes's gaze traveled down, and his nostrils flared again in that way I had come to recognize as a sign of interest. "Inspector," said he, "would you oblige me by stepping outside and looking at the base of that wall? There is a space. Between the flagstones and the earth, you may find something lying there which has no business in a respectable Kensington garden." Lestrade bristled. "I'm not your constable." "No," said Holmes, with mild contempt, "you are your own, which is frequently worse. But if you prefer to remain warm while evidence grows cold, by all means." He turned away as if the matter were settled. With a muttered oath, Lestrade strode out through the French doors, his boots clacking upon the stone. Vane watched him go with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. Holmes, meanwhile, had returned to the cabinet. He opened it, and I observed that Vane's eyes never left Holmes's hands, as though he feared what might be revealed by their touch. Holmes removed several folios, tapping them lightly, and at last drew out a thin strip of paper caught behind the back panels, so artfully placed that only a deliberate search could have discovered it. He read it, and his face became unreadable. "What is it?" I asked in a low voice. "A reminder," said he, and slipped it into his pocket without showing me. Vane took a step forward. "Mr. Holmes, you will tell me you can recover it." That case was of sentimental value. Holmes looked at him. Steadily. "Sentiment is rarely kept in Morocco," said he. "It is more often kept in flesh and blood. Tell me, Mr. Vane, who else knows of this cabinet and its contents?" "My solicitor," said Vane after a pause. my man of business." And his eyes darted to the butler, who stood rigid by the door. "And my cousin, Mr. Silas Rayner. He has been in and out of the house of late." Holmes's head lifted sharply. "Silas Rayner?" "Yes, a poor relation," said Vane bitterly. "Always in need of something. Always pleading. But he was not here last night." At that moment, Lestrade's voice sounded from the terrace, sharp with the excitement of discovery. "Holmes, doctor, come and look at this." We hurried out. At the base of the wall, half in mud and half under the edge of a flagstone, lay a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. Lestrade had it between finger and thumb, as though it might bite him. He unwrapped it, and there, glinting dully in the weak light, was a brass keys, small, ornate, and very fresh. As if it had not long left a locksmith's bench. Vane made a choking sound. "That is why. That resembles the cabinet key," said Holmes, eyes narrowed. "Or rather, its twin." And as I looked from the false key to Holmes's set face, I felt again that tightening of dread. The letter's warning had spoken. True, there was something in this house which must not be allowed into Holmes's hands. And already, by the sheer momentum of his intellect, Hugh was reaching for it. Holmes took the brass key from Lestrade with an air of mild indifference. Yet I observed the subtle tightening of his fingers as the metal touched his skin, as though some current had passed between them. He held it up, turning it so that the weak daylight caught upon its ridges. "New," said he, "cut cleanly, without the softened edges that come of months in a pocket. And yet it has been dirty deliberately at the wards." Lestrade, who disliked any remark that implied his own observation had been incomplete, thrust his chin forward. "A duplicate, then. Someone had it made." Someone had it made, Holmes agreed, and someone wished it found here. A man who hides a key does not place it where a policeman may stumble on it with his heel. Vane had come out upon the terrace, his dressing gown flapping about his legs, his face pale with outrage. "That key proves it," he cried. "It proves. My cousin has been plotting. He has been sniffing about this cabinet for weeks. I refused him money, and now he repays me with burglary," and he broke off, breathing hard. "With that note, with your name, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes rested upon him with a cold patience. "It proves," said he, "that a key exists. It does not yet prove who commissioned it, who used it, or why it was abandoned. You are eager, Mr. Vane, to attach a motive to the first convenient man." Vane flushed, then forced himself into a stiff composure. "You will speak to Rayner," said he. "You will see what he is." "In good time," Holmes replied. "First, we return indoors. Damp air is an enemy to clear thought." As we re-entered the music room, Holmes's gaze went at once to the cabinet, as if the missing morocco case were still present and might be summoned by sheer force of attention. Lestrade hovered close, watchful, his suspicion now taking on the particular relish of a man who believes he holds a lever over one more celebrated than himself. I could not shake the memory of the letter hidden beneath our morning paper, nor the strange instruction bound up with that phrase, "the music room," which seemed to echo now from the walls themselves. Holmes asked Vane to describe the morocco case once more, and this time with none of the dramatic flourishes which had crept into his first account. It was dark red, he said, with a clasp of tarnished silver, and it contained, he hesitated, moistening his lips, papers. "Private papers. Letters," he added at last, in a tone that implied the word itself was indecent. "From whom?" Holmes asked. Vane's eyes flickered away. "That is not your affair." "It is precisely my affair," said Holmes, "since your thief chose to announce himself with my initials. Either you tell me what was stolen, or you may continue your inquiries with Inspector Lestrade, whose imagination is less troublesome to the guilty than mine." Lestrade made a little sound of satisfaction, but Vane's pride struggled with his fear. and fear won. They were letters from a lady, he said hoarsely. A married lady, written years ago. Foolish, affectionate things, kept them God. Forgive me because I could not bear to destroy them. If they are made public, his hands clenched, I should be ruined. She would be ruined. Her husband, he stopped. And the silence that followed was heavy with all the unspoken violence that respectable society reserves for its scandals. Holmes's expression did not soften. But something in his tone altered, as if he had shifted. From the abstract to the human. "And the note," said he, stated, "I take only what was promised. Promised by whom? Promised to whom?" Vane stared at him. "I do not understand." "Then you are a poor steward of your own secrets." Holmes said, "Those words are not the language of a common thief. They are the language of contractive obligation, of a bargain made and then broken." He turned abruptly to the butler. "What is your name?" "Prentice, sir. Mr. Prentice, who besides your master has entered this room in the last 24 hours. The butler's eyes widened a fraction. "No one, sir, save myself to lay the fire and draw the curtains." "At what hour did you lay the fire?" 6:30. "And you touched the cabinet?" "Never, sir." "You are careful," said Holmes, "or instructed." Prentice stiffened. "I have served the family 30 years. Then?" "You have served more than one master," Holmes returned, and moved away before the man could frame a reply. He crossed to the piano again, and with a sudden motion lifted the score from the rest. Beneath it, almost invisible against the polished wood, lay a faint sprinkling of pale grit. He touched it with a wetted fingertip and rubbed it upon his thumb. "Plaster," said he. "Fresh, from a wall or ceiling." Lestrade leaned in. So someone climbed in through the window and scraped the sill. Holmes gave him a glance as one might give a child who has proudly recited the alphabet. "The sill is clean," said he. "The window latch bears no mark. And yet plaster dust lies beneath a score which your client has not moved since last night, unless he has been tidying his own scene." Vane cried out, "Are you accusing me?" "I am accusing no one," said Holmes. "I am refusing to be led." He stooped suddenly and ran his hand along the back of the cabinet where the panel met the wall. His fingers paused at a spot I would have overlooked entirely. He produced a small lens from his pocket and studied it. "A hairline gap," he murmured, "a panel that can be slid if one knows where to press." With the delicacy of a surgeon, he applied pressure, and to my amazement, a narrow section of the back shifted inward by a fraction. Behind it, hidden in darkness, was a shallow cavity. Holmes's hand darted in and withdrew not the morocco case, but a folded scrap of paper, the very one he had earlier secreted into his pocket. Now he opened it, where all could see. Upon it were written 3 words, in the same bold hand that had impersonated his own: "Bring him alone." Lestrade swore softly. Vane's face had gone ashen. I felt, as if in a dream, the letter's warning blazing anew in my mind. "Do not trust me. Do not permit the thing into my hands. If I come with you, lie to me." The scrap in Holmes's fingers was no mere clue, it was an instruction aimed at him, and it had been concealed in the very furniture that guarded Vane's scandal. Someone had wanted Holmes here, wanted him engaged, wanted him maneuvered. Holmes looked up, his eyes bright, with that dangerous calm which came upon him when the game was deeper than any ordinary crime. "Mr. Vane," said he, "your cousin Silas Rayner will be our first line of inquiry, but do not indulge yourself with certainty. Your thief is not stealing for profit. He is stealing for leverage. Inspector, you will remain with Mr. Vane. Watson, you come with me." He paused, and for the first time his voice carried a hint of iron, and no one least of all Scotland Yard leaves. "This house with so much as a pencil, until I am satisfied there is nothing else concealed in this room." Lestrade bristled. But Holmes had already turned for the door. I followed, my mind in turmoil. For I realized that the trap described by that impossible letter was tightening around us with every step Holmes took tightening. Perhaps not to catch Julian Vane's thief at all, but to catch Sherlock Holmes himself. Holmes walked ahead of me through the hall with that swift, purpose-driven stride which always suggested that his thoughts had outpaced his body and were tugging it onward by an invisible cord. Behind us, somewhere in the house, Lestrade's voice rose and fell in querulous interrogation. And Julian Vane's answered with the brittle impatience of a man who fears exposure more than theft. The butler shut the door after us with the quiet finality of a servant accustomed to sealing scandal within respectable walls. Outside, Kensington wore its winter dignity like a shroud. The street was clean, the houses prim, the very trees clipped to decorum. Yet the fog that drifted in pale ribbons along the railings seemed to hint that even here, among comfort and polished brass, London could still conceal its claws. Holmes paused upon the step, and I saw him glance not at the roadway, but at the fanlight above the door and the sooty ledge beneath it, as though he expected the stone itself to confess. "We are observed," said he, under his breath. I turned sharply, my heart giving a leap. Where? Holmes's eyes remained upon the blank respectability of Ainsley Gardens. "If I told you," he replied, "it would cease to be useful. But you may take it, Watson, that our friend who writes in my hand is not content to leave his letters in cabinets. He prefers to watch what they do." We started on foot, not towards the main thoroughfares, but by a series of quieter turnings. Holmes chose his route as a man chooses words deliberately, with a view to effect. Twice he doubled back unexpectedly. Once he paused to stare into a shop window displaying silver-mounted walking sticks. And once he halted to light his pipe, though it had not gone out. Each movement, I realized, was a question flung into the street. "Are you there? Will you follow? Will you betray yourself?" Yet if any answer came, it came to Holmes alone. "You mean to see this cousin?" said I at last. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "I mean to see the man whom Mr. Vane most wishes me to see. That is not always the same thing. Vane is convinced of his guilt. Vane is convinced of his own virtue," Holmes returned. "And virtue, when it has something to lose, is the most inventive liar in England." I hesitated, the hidden letter burning like a coal in my memory. More than once, since leaving Baker Street, I had been tempted to show it to him, to throw the whole poisoned thing into the light. Yet the warning had been explicit, and for the first time in our long companionship, I found myself in the degrading position of guarding my friend from himself by means of concealment. I told myself it was temporary, that the first safe moment would free me. But I knew, too, that Holmes's mind once set upon a course swept aside. Safe moments as a river sweeps aside fallen leaves. Holmes halted before a small tobacconist and stepped within. I followed, blinking at the warm fog of scented leaf. The proprietor, a bent old fellow with yellow fingers, looked up with the incurious patience of trade. Then his eyes widened slightly, not at Holmes's face, but at his manner of entering, as if he had been expecting him. Holmes said nothing of our business. He asked for a particular, tobacco something coarse and foreign, and, while the old man's back was turned, he let his gaze travel over a cluttered counter where papers lay for sale. Among them, half hidden beneath the day's Pall Mall Gazette, I saw a folded note, its edge protruding like the corner of a card in a conjurer's sleeve. Holmes's hand moved, swift as a striking snake. He had the note, had slipped it into his pocket, and had resumed his idle air before the shopkeeper turned again. He paid, thanked the man, and stepped back into the street. Only when we had gone 50 yards did he draw out the paper and open it. It was blank. Holmes smiled faintly. "So," said he, "he wishes me to know he can reach me whenever he pleases. A blank note. I could not keep the irritation from my voice. "What possible value?" "It is not the note," Holmes interrupted, "but the delivery. A hand near enough to place it where my fingers would naturally fall. A shopkeeper either bribed, intimidated, or wholly ignorant. And the certainty that I should enter that shop at this hour. It is a message of confidence." "Confidence in what?" "In his map of my habits," said Holmes. "In his ability to steer me." We had reached a narrow lane leading to a mews, where the air smelled of damp straw and horse. A boy in a cap lounged by a gate, whistling. Holmes's eyes flicked to him and away again. "You have been here an hour," said Holmes. The boy stopped whistling. "No, I ain't." "Yes," Holmes continued calmly. "And you have been given a penny to say that Mr. Silas Rayner is out, should anyone inquire." The lad's mouth fell open. Holmes stepped closer, and though he did not raise his voice, something in his tone made the boy's bravado crumble like ash. "Who paid you?" he asked. The boy licked his lips. "A gent. Said he'd be back. Said I were to keep watch." "Describe him." "Tall, like you. Coat with a velvet collar. Smelled of stuff, like medicine." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his eyes harden. "Opium," he murmured. "Or chloral. Interesting." He slipped a coin into the boy's palm. "You will forget you ever saw me," said he. "But you will remember this. If the gentleman returns, you will run to the nearest constable and say only that a fire has broken out in the stable loft. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, hypnotized by Holmes's certainty. Holmes pushed open. The gate hand led the way into the mews. At the far end stood a small house above stabling, its windows curtained, its paint peeling with that genteel neglect which speaks of dwindling means. Holmes mounted the steps and knocked not loudly, but with a particular rhythm, as if he had already heard the answering footfall in his mind. There was a pause. Then the door opened a cautious inch, held by a chain. An eye appeared, sharp and suspicious. "Yes?" Holmes's voice softened into something almost friendly. "Mr. Silas Rayner, I believe. Come from Mr. Julian Vane." The chain slid back. The door opened wider, and there, framed in the dim interior, stood a man of perhaps 40, thin, well-dressed in a slightly threadbare fashion, with restless hands and a smile, too ready to be sincere. His eyes darted at once to Holmes's face, then to mine, then back again, as if taking measurements. "Mr. Holmes," said Rayner, and the name upon his tongue sounded rehearsed. "How very good of you to come." My blood ran cold. Rayner had not been told Holmes would come, yet he expected him. Perhaps more than that, perhaps this whole path, from the music room to this shabby mews, had been laid in advance like a trail of crumbs for Holmes to follow. Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. "You know me," said he. Rayner's smile widened. "Who does not?" Holmes's gaze swept the room in one quick, comprehensive glance. I saw, as he saw, the half-burned candle, the scattered ash, the unopened letter on the mantel cream paper, thick, expensive, and beside it a pen, the nib still wet. Rayner followed Holmes's eyes, and, for the briefest instant, the smile faltered. Holmes's voice was very quiet. "You have been practicing my hand?" said he. Rayner laughed too quickly. "Surely, Mr. Holmes, you do not accuse." Holmes took one step nearer. "I accuse nothing," said he. I observe also that you have been waiting for my alone." He paused, and I felt the weight of that other instruction, the one I had been unable to obey. Bring him alone. Holmes had come with me, and yet Rayner had expected him without me. The trap was adjusting itself even now. Rayner's gaze slid to me, and something hard glittered behind his civility. "Your friend may find the air below rather close," said he smoothly. Perhaps he would wait outside. Holmes did not look at me, but I felt with sudden clarity, that whatever lay ahead would require a choice between loyalty and obedience. Between the letter's warning and the man who had never yet been wrong, Watson stays, said Holmes. Rayner's smile returned thin. As paper. As you wish, he said. Then let us speak of what Mr. Vane has lost, and what you, Mr. Holmes, are about to find. Rayner shut the door with an exaggerated care, as though the click of the latch were an assurance that nothing spoken within could leak into the mews. The room into which he had admitted us was narrow and over-furnished, with the air of a lodging taken in haste by a man who wished to appear settled. A horsehair sofa, shiny with age, faced a small grateware. A fire struggled among cheap coal. Upon the mantel stood a row of little silver-framed photographs turned discreetly face down, while on the table lay a scatter of paper counts, letters, and one sheet of thick cream notepaper which my eye returned to again and again, as if its very texture mocked us with its similarity to the envelope that had arrived at Baker Street. You are direct, Mr. Holmes. Rayner began, drawing a chair towards the fire and seating himself with an ease too practiced to be natural. Most men would have approached this delicately. Family matters, you understand? Holmes remained standing. His glance traveled once more over the inkwell pen upon the mantel and the faint smudge upon Rayner's forefinger. I have seldom found delicacy to be a substitute for truth, said he. Mr. Vane's morocco case has been stolen. A note was left, written in my hand. Mr. Vane suspects you. Scotland Yard suspects me. And you, he paused, letting the words fall like weights, have been expecting this visit. Rayner spread his hands. Expecting? No. Hoping, perhaps. You are famous for appearing where you are least wanted. And yet you told the boy at the gate to say you were out. Rayner's eyes flickered, and for an instant the mask slipped. One takes precautions. Against whom? Holmes's voice sharpened. Your cousin? The police? Or the man who has taught you to mimic? Another's hand. Rayner laughed softly and leaned forward, warming his palms. You mistake me for a forger, said he. I am merely a man who has been pushed too far. Julian Vane has made promises to me, promises to others, and he keeps none of them. When a gentleman reneges, Mr. Holmes, he cannot complain. If the world recovers what is owed. Holmes's face remained impassive, but I saw the quick, almost imperceptible motion of his eyes as they took in Rayner's boots. Clean, with a trace of pale grit at the well-tan, the faint line of plaster dust on the cuff. So you admit you have taken the case, said he. Rayner's smile widened. I admit nothing. But I will say this. Your name has been used, Mr. Holmes, because your name opens doors. It opens Julian's door, certainly. It opens Scotland Yard's mind as well. They will chase where you point. I have pointed nowhere, Holmes replied. Not yet, said Rayner, and there was a relish in it. But you will. Your curiosity is notorious. Holmes stepped closer, and his shadow fell across the papers like a guillotine blade. What was in the morocco case? Rayner's eyes hardened. Letters, said he at last, a sort that destroy reputations, the sort that make widowers generous and cowards bold. Julian kept them like a miser keeps gold. He promised years ago to hand them over when certain conditions were met. He did not. So the letters were taken. Taken by whom? Rayner lifted his shoulders by the hand that could take them. Holmes's nostrils flared. You speak as though there were another party. There is always another party. Rayner returned and rose, moving to the mantel. He picked up the cream sheet of paper and waved it lightly. You see this? I was practicing your hand, as you so kindly observed. Not because I wished to deceive, but because I was instructed. The instruction came with money. I have not had much money of late, Mr. Holmes. Poverty is a tutor with very persuasive lessons. I felt my pulse quicken. Who instructed you? I demanded. Rayner's gaze slid to me with faint contempt. A gentleman, said he. Tall, refined. He spoke like a man who had been educated above his station or fallen below it. He smelled, as boys say, of medicine. He offered me coin to copy a few lines. I copied them. What harm? It is not a hanging matter to imitate pen strokes. Holmes's voice cut in, low and dangerous. Did he give you the words? Rayner hesitated. Sometimes. Sometimes he brought his own. Sometimes he asked me to write what I pleased, so long as it looked like you. Holmes's eyes flashed, and he asked you to bring me alone. Rayner stared. How? Holmes's hand had darted out. He seized Rayner's wrist, and, before the man could jerk away, he had turned the hand palm up. There, at the base of the thumb, was a faint puncture larger than a pinprick around it, a slight yellowing of the skin. Holmes released him at once, as though the touch had confirmed some unpleasant truth. Morphia, said he. Or something akin. You have been dosed you have dosed yourself to steady nerves that are not equal to the game you have joined. Rayner snatched his hand back, white with anger. You'd think me an addict. I think you are frightened, said Holmes, and that you have reason. Where are the letters now? Rayner's breath came quick. He glanced involuntarily towards the back of the room, where a narrow door stood half ajar, perhaps to a bedroom. I don't have them, he burst out. I never had them. I never went to Ainsley Gardens. I never touched Julian's cabinet. I only wrote what I was paid to write. The Key-S, I commissioned it. I thought God help me. I thought I might use it to frighten him into paying what he owed. But before I dared, this gentleman came and took it from me. He said he had better use for it. Lestrade's satisfaction at this confession would have been immense. Yet to me, it brought no relief at all. A duplicate key, a planted clue, a forged hand. The whole affair was being staged, with Rayner as a trembling prop. Holmes was very still. Describe this gentleman precisely, said he. Rayner swallowed. He wore a velvet-collared coat. His hands were fine, but his nails, he frowned. His nails were stained, like a man who handles chemicals. He had a way of looking at you as if you were already decided upon. And he said, Rayner's voice dropped. He said you were predictable, that you would come when summoned, because you cannot endure a mystery with your own name on it. Holmes's mouth tightened. And did he give you anything to pass? To me, Rayner shook his head quickly. No, only threats. He said if I spoke of him, my cousin would be ruined and I would hang with him. He said Scotland Yard would thank him for delivering Sherlock Holmes at last. At those words, I saw for the first time a flicker of something like anger in Holmes's eyes, not personal vanity wounded, but the cold fury of a mind recognizing a deliberate insult to reason. He turned abruptly and strode to the half-open door at the back. Rayner sprang forward. There's nothing. Holmes pushed it wide. Beyond was a cramped bedroom, neat to the point of desperation. A washstand, a narrow bed. And on the pillow, as if laid there for Holmes's discovery, a small object wrapped in red morocco. My throat tightened. It was the case. Rayner gave a strangled cry. I swear to you, Holmes did not touch it at once. A case stood over it, head slightly bowed, as if listening. Then he produced his lens, examined the clasp, the stitching, the very fibers of the cloth beneath. Placed within the last hour, he murmured, no dust, no settling. And the scent, he leaned nearer. Chloral hydrate. I stepped forward, despite myself. Holmes, leave it, I said, and the urgency in my voice surprised even me. He looked up sharply. For an instant, the room seemed to narrow around the two of us, as if all the plot's threads had drawn tight at that point. His gaze searched my face with that terrible clarity which had so often read the truth in criminals and clients alike. "Why, Watson?" he asked quietly. "Why should I leave the very object we came to find? Because a letter in your own hand told me not to let you have it. I thought, but the words stuck like thorns in my throat." Rayner backed away, sweating. "Take it then," he whispered. "Take it and be done. Only get out of here before he comes back." Holmes's fingers hovered over the morocco case, and in that suspended moment reason warred with obedience, and my loyalty to my friend warred with the impossible warning. I realized with sick certainty that whoever had written in Holmes's hand had arranged this scene for one purpose only: to make Sherlock Holmes pick up that case, and by doing so, to place something far more dangerous than love letters into his grasp. Holmes's fingers hung above the morocco case as delicately as a pianist's above a treacherous chord. In the cramped bedroom, the air seemed to have thickened, not with smoke, but with the tension of three wills pulling against one another. Rayner's panic, my own dread, and Holmes's cold, relentless hunger for certainty. He looked from the case to the pillow beneath it, and then to the door jamb, as though the very grain of the wood might betray the hand that had lately passed. "It is placed," he said at last, withdrawing his hand as if the object had burned him. "And whatever is placed with intention." Rayner's knees seemed ready to give. "Then leave it," he whispered. "For God's sake, leave it and go. He said you'd touch it. He said you couldn't help yourself." Holmes's eyes flashed. He repeated softly, "You have not been consistent. Mr. Rayner, a moment ago you spoke of a gentleman who might return. Now you speak as if he were expected." Rayner's mouth worked soundlessly. His gaze darted to the window, to the bed, to me, and finally back to Holmes. "He comes and goes," he stammered, "like a shadow. He has keys for everything. He makes you feel the house is his, even when it's yours." Holmes stepped into the bedroom and, ignoring the case, began to examine the immediate surroundings. With extraordinary minuteness, he ran his fingertips over the washstand, paused at the rim of the basin, and then lifted a small, damp cloth from the chair. He held it nearer his face, sniffed once, and his expression tightened. "Chloral," he murmured. "As I thought, but not recently spilled, recently used." I stared at him. "Used for what?" "For sleep," said Holmes. "Or for making a man who does not wish to sleep do so." Rayner made a strangled noise. He never," he began, and then stopped, for his own protest rang hollow in his ears. Holmes's attention shifted to a narrow crack beneath the skirting board. He took out his knife, prized delicately, and drew forth a thin sliver of wood with a faint scratch upon it, so faint that to any eye but his it would have been a natural flaw. He held it up to the light. "A wedge," said he, "used to prevent a door from fully closing or fully opening without leaving a mark. Whoever arranged this little tableau desired control over the exact instant of entry." He crossed back into the sitting room and stood very still, head tilted, like a man listening for distant music. I heard nothing at first but the ticking of a cheap clock and Rayner's uneven breathing. Then, faintly, came a sound from below, the slow, heavy creak of wood under a measured step. Rayner's face emptied of color. "He's here," he breathed. Holmes's voice was low and rapid. "Watson, stand to the right of the door, not behind it. If he enters quickly, the first blow will be blind. Mr. Rayner, you will sit. You will say nothing unless I ask, and you will keep your hands where I can see them." Rayner collapsed into the chair by the fire, as if his bones had turned to water. His eyes were fixed on the door, wide and glassy, like those of a rabbit which has at last scented the hound. The creak came again nearer now. A pause. Then the soft click of a latch being tried with practiced care. Lestrade's face rose in my mind. Lestrade at Vane's house, certain he had his culprit. Lestrade. Who would see the case and seize it, the letters and the scandal, and clap Holmes in irons if he could. Yet here, in this shabby mews lodging, the machinery seemed more delicate and far more deadly than any simple arrest. The door opened. Man stepped in with the unhurried assurance of one who enters by right. He was tall and spare, his coat, indeed, velvet-collared, his gloves immaculate. And yet there was a suggestion of disorder about him as, though elegance, had been put on hastily to conceal something restless underneath. His face was pale, the cheekbones high, the mouth refined, the eyes bright with that hard brilliance which I have seen in men whose nerves have been scoured by stimulants and sustained by purpose alone. He carried a small leather case under one arm, like a physician. His gaze fell first upon Raynor, and I saw contempt there. Then it shifted to Holmes, and in that instant, though no word was spoken, I felt the shock of two minds recognizing one another across a battlefield. "Mr. Holmes," said the stranger with a faint inclination. "How prompt you are." Holmes returned the bow as if they stood in a drawing-room and not in a trap. "Sir," said he, "you have gone to considerable trouble to borrow my hand. You might have done me the courtesy of borrowing my name as well." The man smiled. "Names are such clumsy things. A handwriting is more intimate." "And more incriminating," Holmes replied. The stranger's eyes glinted. "Incriminating is a matter of who controls the narrative. At present, Scotland Yard has a note in your hand at the scene of a theft, and a witness who will swear you were in Kensington. Soon, his gaze flicked briefly towards Raynor. They will have rather more." Raynor whimpered, a small involuntary snore. Sound. Holmes's voice remained calm. "You have staged this to bring me into contact with the Morocco case," said he. "I have not touched it." "Not yet," said the stranger, and his smile broadened. "But you will, because you cannot bear a closed box." Holmes took a half-step forward. "You mistake my curiosity for compulsion." The stranger's hand moved lazily, and I saw then the small glass vial between his fingers, clear liquid within, catching the firelight. "Do I?" he said. "A drop upon the skin, a moment's distraction, and the great Sherlock Holmes will do precisely what he swears he will not." I had my revolver out before I fully knew it, the motion drilled into me by Afghan knights. The stranger did not flinch. His gaze slid to the weapon with a mild, almost amused interest. "Ah," said he, "Dr. Watson. The warm blood in the partnership." Holmes's voice sharpened, cutting through the room like a wire. "Put it down," he said, "or I shall be forced to demonstrate that your knowledge of me is incomplete." The stranger's eyes did not leave Holmes's face. "You were always fond of demonstrations," he murmured. "Very well." He set the vial upon the mantel with exaggerated gentleness. Holmes's gaze went to it, then to the stranger's stained fingernails, and then swift as thought to the leather case under his arm. "A medical man," Holmes said softly, "or a chemist who plays at medicine. You smell of disinfectant and ether, but also of bitter almonds." The stranger's smile faltered for the first time. "How very clever." "Not clever," Holmes replied, "merely attentive. You have been using chloral to manage your puppets, and you carry something more volatile for your adversaries. Prussic acid leaves little mark, and in the confusion of scandal it would be easy to call it suicide." Raynor gave a choking sob. The stranger's eyes narrowed. "You speak with confidence for a man already half convicted." Holmes's face was like stone. "And you speak with assurance for a man standing within reach of a soldier's revolver." The stranger's gaze slid again to my weapon, and I saw calculation there, cool, swift, dispassionate. "Let us not be crude," said he. "I did not come to murder anyone. I came to correct a huge misunderstanding. Mr. Raynor has been useful, but he is unreliable. He has permitted you to find what was meant for you." Holmes's voice was very quiet. "The Morocco case." "The case," the man agreed. "You will take it, Mr. Holmes. You will take it in anger or in triumph, it does not matter which. And then you will open it." Holmes's eyes bored into him. "And what is in it?" The stranger's smile returned, thinner now. "A letter," said he, "arrived in Baker Street, written in your handwriting." And at that dreadful phrase, so close to the title I had already framed in my mind, understood that the theft from Julian Vane had been only the outer shell of the mystery. The true crime was being prepared here and now, not against an aristocrat's reputation, but against Holmes's own identity. The stranger lifted his hat with ironic politeness. "3 days, Mr. Holmes," said he softly. "Do not disappoint me." He turned towards the door. "Stop him," I cried. Holmes moved like a released spring, but the man had already stepped back. In that instant, the wedge Holmes had found did its work. The door swung not outward into the mews, but inward against its own frame, sticking fast for the space of a heartbeat. A heartbeat was enough. The stranger slipped through the narrow gap he had prepared, and the door rebounded with a jarring thud, locked from outside. Rayner screamed. Holmes wrenched at the latch, jaw set, eyes blazing not with panic, but with that fierce exhilaration which comes when an enemy at last shows his hand. "Watson," he said, "the case is no longer bait. It is a fuse." And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the next move, whether by Holmes's will or by our adversary's design, would ignite the whole dreadful contrivance. Holmes threw his shoulder against the door, and the whole frail structure shuddered, but the wedge held with the obstinacy of a thing fashioned for that single moment. He stepped back at once, not from exhaustion, but from calculation, and his eyes swept the room as if it were a diagram. Rayner had slid down in his chair, his face slick with sweat, his lips working soundlessly. I kept my revolver raised, though I knew well enough that powder and lead were useless against a locked door and a man already vanished into London. The window, said Holmes, was already there. He wrenched the sash up. It rose 2 inches, and stopped, caught by a pin driven through the frame. He smiled grimly. "Every exit accounted for," said he. "He is not merely bold, he is thorough." Rayner gave a sob. "He'll ruin me," he moaned. "He'll ruin Julian. He'll ruin you." Holmes turned on him with sudden ferocity. "Silence," he snapped. Then, mastering himself as quickly as he had flared, he spoke in a low, steady voice. "No one is ruined while his mind is intact. Tell me what he said to you, every word, every gesture, the moment he first approached you." Rayner blinked, dragged back from the edge of hysteria by the authority in Holmes's tone. "He came 2 weeks ago," he whispered. "At night, he knew my name. He knew Julian's. He said I had been wronged and would be paid twice over if I helped to balance an account. He asked for nothing illegal at first, only copying. Then he brought the key. He said it must be found at the garden wall. He said the note must be in your hand, and he laughed. God, he laughed when he told me the inspector would swallow it like bread and butter." Holmes's eyes narrowed. He spoke of Lestrade specifically. Rayner nodded miserably. He called him a straight spine with a crooked mind. He said Scotland Yard could be made to dance with one tug at its pride. Holmes drew a slow breath. He crouched by the door and slipped his knife beneath the edge again. With a deft twist, he levered out the wedge he had earlier discovered, and the latch yielded at once. The door swung open as if it had never resisted us, and a rush of cold mews air poured in. "He left it to be found," I said. "Of course," Holmes replied. "A locked door is a stage direction, Watson. It is meant to impress upon the actors. that the scene has changed. We hurried down the narrow stair into the yard below. A stable boy stared at us, open-mouthed, and somewhere a horse stamped impatiently. Holmes was not looking at faces. He was looking at ground, at the damp cobbles, at the thin runnels of soot-stained water, at the faint scuff where a heel had turned. "There!" I cried, pointing to the far end of the mews where the gate stood ajar. Holmes was already in motion. He shot through the gate and into the lane beyond, moving with such speed that I had difficulty keeping pace. Yet even in his haste he glanced up at windows, at the angle of a doorway, at the curl of smoke from a chimney, as if the whole street were an open book, and he read it. While running dot at the corner, he stopped so suddenly that I nearly collided with him. A hansom cab was turning into the main road, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the stones. The driver's whip flicked, and the vehicle was away into the fog. Holmes's gaze lingered on it, and I saw the calculation in his face. Distance, speed, the probability of a glimpse, the cost of pursuit. Then, with a faint hiss of irritation, he turned aside and began walking, as though the chase were beneath him. "You let him go?" I gasped. Holmes's eyes were cold. "He wished to be chased," said he. "If we run along. A line he has already drawn. I will not spend my strength proving his cleverness." We made our way back, not to Baker Street at once, but to a small public house off a quieter thoroughfare where the fog lay thick and men spoke in mutters. Holmes took a table in a corner and ordered coffee, black and strong. His fingers drummed once on the wood and then stilled. I knew that gesture thought assembling itself, piece by piece, into a structure. "He promised you a letter," I said. "At last, a letter written in your handwriting." Holmes's gaze lifted. "Yes." And he spoke of 3 days. He paused. "Watson, tell me, when did the first letter arrive at Baker Street?" My mouth went dry. Here it was the very point at which concealment became betrayal. I heard again the impossible line, "Do not trust me, even if I beg it of you." Yet I had seen Holmes's hands hover over the morocco case with a restraint that was not habitual. He had, in that instant, trusted something, perhaps my tone, perhaps my urgency, perhaps an instinct he would deny owning. And now he asked me. "Directly it arrived this morning," I said carefully. Holmes held my eyes and its contents. "It warned," I began, and stopped. The room seemed to tilt as it had when Lestrade spoke the name Julian Vane. It warned of exactly this. Holmes's face did not change, but something in his posture tightened, as if a wire had been drawn taut within him. "You have it?" "No," I lied, and the lie tasted like poison. I left it. Holmes's eyes stayed on me a moment longer, and I could not tell whether he believed me or merely logged the evasion as another datum. He looked away at last, down at his coffee, as if the black surface held reflections no one else could see. "Our adversary," said he, very quietly, "has done something I have not encountered in years. He has made my friendship with you, variable in his equation." I felt heat rise in my face. "Holmes, if you suspect, I suspect," he interrupted, "that you are frightened for me, which is both touching and useless. Fear is rarely a good counselor." He leaned forward. The morocco case was placed in Rayner's bed so that I would seize it in triumph and carry it straight into Lestrade's hands. That would make the story complete: theft, forged note, possession of stolen goods, and scandalous letters besides. The public would delight in it. Scotland Yard would preen. Mr. Julian Vane would shriek. And Sherlock Holmes, his mouth tightened, would be reduced to a common criminal by the evidence of his own handwriting. "And the poison?" I asked. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Insurance," said he. "A man who frames does not object to killing when the frame slips." For a moment he sat very still, and I saw in him not the brilliant machine of deduction, but a lonely man fighting on ground chosen by another. Then the familiar fire returned to his eyes. "We must alter the board," said he. "We shall not return to Vane first. We shall return to Baker Street. We shall secure every scrap of paper I have written in the last month. We shall discover how my hand has been copied, whether by stolen correspondence, by tracing, by some infernal mechanical contrivance. And we shall pay a visit to one man in London who can tell me what is circulating among the printers and the police." "Who is that?" Holmes rose, coat already in hand. "My brother," said he. And after that he paused at the door, looking out into the fog as if he saw through it to the mind that moved within. "After that, Watson, we shall do the one thing our enemy cannot predict." I followed him into the street, my conscience heavy as lead and my resolve hardening with every step. I had lied to Sherlock Holmes for what I told myself was his own good. But I knew now that the lie would not rest quietly. It would demand its price, and the bill, as ever in Holmes's world, would come due at the worst possible moment. Holmes took me straight to Baker Street, but not by the most direct route. He chose instead a succession of crowded crossings and narrow byways where a man might be lost in a press of coats, then suddenly reappear in the open like a swimmer breaking surface. Once, as we passed a chemist's shop whose windows were crowded with blue bottles and pale jars, he halted so abruptly that I felt my pulse jump. But it was only to observe a clerk within, who glanced out too often and too quickly to be innocent of curiosity. Holmes's eyes met mine for an instant, and in that glance I read his unspoken command. "Remember everything, trust nothing, speak." Little Dot, when we reached our rooms, the first thing he did was to cross to the escritoire and unlock it with a key he wore on his watch chain. He drew out a sheaf of letters and notes, his own correspondence, drafts of his chemical memoranda, even the scrap on which he had once sketched the pattern of footprints at Boscombe Pool, and spread them upon the table. "Like a player laying out cards, they have not merely imitated my hand," he said. "They have studied my habits. The rhythm of my pen, yes, but also the sort of phrases I use when I choose to be brief." His finger moved over a line in one letter. "Observe here, in good time. I write that when I wish to dismiss a fool without wasting oxygen. It appears in the forged instructions at Vane's cabinet. Coincidence is possible. Convergence is not." I stood awkwardly by the hearth, conscious of the newspaper beneath which I had hidden the first impossible warning. My mind felt divided. One part watched Holmes's swift, methodical labor with the old admiration. The other waited in dread. For the moment, my concealment would be dragged into the light like a corpse from the Thames. Holmes, however, did not touch the newspaper. He seemed, for the time being, to have set that particular thread aside, either from lack of certainty or from a deliberate kindness which, in him, could never be obvious. He took up a magnifying glass and examined the edges of several sheets. "A forger who traces," he murmured, "leaves telltale hesitations at curves and pressure marks where the hand pauses to follow the original. A forger who copies by eye leaves consistent, errors tiny, personal habits of his own, yet these," he tapped the paper, "show neither. The pressure varies as mine varies. The speed rises and falls as mine rises and falls." That suggests a third method, a mechanical one, Kay asked. Holmes's eyes lifted. "Precisely, a pantograph can copy shape, but not pressure. There are devices crude, but improving, which can reproduce a hand by guiding the pen along a groove or by transferring inked impressions with disturbing fidelity. Such contrivances are not in the possession of street criminals. They belong to engineers, to instrument makers, to men who sell precision to those with money and malice." A knock sounded below, and Mrs. Hudson's voice rose with her usual anxious politeness. In another moment, Mycroft Holmes came in, as if he had always been there, and merely stepped out for air. Mycroft was bulkier than his brother, his face fuller, his eyes heavy-lidded. Yet behind that indolent exterior lay, I knew, a mind as vast as Holmes's was sharp, a mind which grasped the machinery of government the way Holmes grasped the machinery of crime. "You sent for me with unusual urgency," Mycroft observed, removing his gloves with slow fastidiousness. "One might almost suppose you were in trouble." Holmes did not rise. "I am an inconvenience," said he. "Trouble is for men who cannot calculate their exits." Mycroft's gaze moved to the papers. "Forgery. Identity. Holmes. Corrected. Someone is writing in my hand, leaving my initials at scenes, and attempting to arrange a public fall." He spoke of Julian Vane, of the Morocco case, of Rayner's cowardly cooperation, and of the chemist's odor, the bitter almonds which had hung about the stranger like a calling card. Mycroft listened without interruption, his fingers steepled. Only when Holmes mentioned prussic acid did Mycroft's eyes sharpen a fraction. "There is a rumor," said he at last, "which has reached even the dull corridors of Whitehall. A certain set of radicals and blackmailers, men who trade in scandal as others trade in coal, have lately been boasting of a new handwriting which can be purchased. Not forged, they say, but manufactured. It is spoken of among printers and among those who bribe printers." Holmes leaned forward. "Names?" Mycroft's mouth twitched. "You asked me to do your work. As usual, you will do it better," said Holmes coolly, "because you are closer to the sewer's mouth." Mycroft's gaze slid to me, and I felt suddenly, uncomfortably, that he saw more than I wished him to see. "There is one instrument maker," he continued, "whose clientele is eclectic. A German by birth, an Englishman by convenience. He operates near Clerkenwell under the respectable guise of producing precision devices for draftsmen and surveyors. His name is Karl, though whether that is his true name I could not say. He has been visited recently by a man answering to your description: tall, fine hands, chemical stains. He is known in certain circles as the apothecary." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Where may we find Mr. Karl?" Mycroft named an address with maddening calm. Holmes stood at once, all coiled energy. "Not so fast," Mycroft said. "The police have also heard whispers. Lestrade, in particular, has been given something like a leash and thinks he holds it. If you act openly, you will be met not by Karl, but by a warrant." Holmes's smile was thin. "Then I shall act as I always do when England grows bureaucratic." Mycroft sighed. "You will become someone else." Holmes's gaze shifted to the hat stand, to the old battered case which held, I knew, his disguises. "Yes," he said, "and Watson will become inconveniently honest." Mycroft's brows lifted. Holmes looked at me, then truly looked, in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Watson," he said quietly, "what did the first letter say?" The room seemed suddenly too warm, too small. My throat constricted. I could have lied again, but the lie would have been seen and recorded and used against me by the very man I wished to protect. I crossed to the table, drew the hidden paper from beneath the newspaper with fingers that felt clumsy as mittens, and laid it before him. Holmes read it once, swiftly. Then again, slowly. When he finished, he did not speak for several seconds. Mycroft watched him with a new attention. At last, Holmes folded the letter with exquisite care. "So," he murmured, "he writes to you through me, and to me through you. You are angry," I said. Holmes's voice was quiet. "I am grateful," he replied, and the words struck me harder than anger would have done. "Grateful that you hesitated. Grateful that you tried, however awkwardly, to obey a warning while not betraying your friend." His eyes hardened. "And grateful that our enemy believes I cannot resist a closed box." He turned to Mycroft. "In 3 days," said he. "He means to force a public humiliation, perhaps an arrest, by placing that Morocco case where I must either seize it or appear guilty by refusing. He tapped the letter. But I shall not play defense. Mycroft's tone was mild. What will you do instead? Holmes's smile returned cold, bright, and dangerous. I shall give him what he wants, said he. Not the Morocco case. Not my signature? Not my reputation. I shall give him Sherlock Holmes, exactly where he expects, while the man who arrives is not Sherlock Holmes at all. And as he spoke, reaching already for the disguise case as a pianist reaches for a familiar instrument, I realized that the next act of this drama would not be fought in the comfortable abstraction of deduction, but in the streets themselves where one false step, one misplaced word, and the trap laid in a handwriting too perfect to doubt might. Close upon us with the finality of iron, Holmes was dressed when I returned to the sitting room, but not as himself. It is difficult to convey, even now, the completeness with which he could discard his own identity as a man discards a coat. The long, spare figure had become a bent, shabby creature with one shoulder higher than the other, a blotched complexion, and a watery eye that blinked too often. A patch of gray whisker, ragged and unkempt, made a new face of the old. He might have been any half-broken messenger from the riverside, any hanger-on of markets and courts. Only the intensity of the gaze, when it turned upon me for an instant before lowering again, betrayed that the mind behind the disguise remained keen as a razor. You will go as yourself, he said, in that altered voice which was thick and nasal with a whining note. If you accompany me, you will betray me. If you do not accompany me, you will protect me. That is nonsense, I replied hotly. I shall not allow you. He lifted a hand, and the familiar authority, even through the mask, checked me. Watson, said he, our opponent, counts upon two things: that I will seize the Morocco case, and that you will prevent me from making a fool of myself. He uses your loyalty as a rein. Therefore, for once, you must not pull. Mycroft, who had remained seated with the air of a man watching an unpleasant play he has already read, stirred slightly. You intend to visit Karl in Clerkenwell, said he, and you intend to do so in a manner that will not invite a policeman's curiosity. Holmes's disguised mouth twisted. I intend to be noticed, he said, but noticed as the wrong man. I have already sent word that I will call at a certain hour. Our apothecary expects Sherlock Holmes. He shall receive a beggar with a message on. If his nerves are as overstrained as I suspect, he will overplay his hand. He went to the mantel and took up the little vial the stranger had placed there, turning it so the liquid slid against the glass. He left this as one leaves a signature, he said. To frighten you, to tempt me, to remind me that the game is not about stolen letters, but about my own control. He set it down again. I do not like being reminded. I could not keep my eyes from the table where the warning letter lay, folded now with a neatness that seemed almost reverent. The phrase in it 3 days throbbed in my mind like a headache. Holmes, I said, suppose he does not mean scandal alone? Suppose he means murder? Holmes's head tilted. Then we shall be punctual, he replied. Murder is the one appointment a man cannot miss. Within the hour I found myself in Kensington once more, but not at Ainsley Gardens. Lestrade, as Holmes had predicted, had not remained where he was ordered. Scotland Yard does not like to be told to sit. I learned from a constable at the corner that the inspector had already taken Julian Vane to the station to make a statement, and that certain gentlemen of the press had been seen hovering like carrion birds. The machinery of public shame was already turning. I hired a cab and went at once to the station. There, after some delay and much affronted dignity upon my part, I was admitted to a corridor smelling of damp wool and ink. Lestrade met me with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well, doctor," said he, "your friend's been busy, hasn't he? What have you done?" I demanded. What I ought to do, he replied. I've secured the victim, the evidence, and the suspect. He tapped his breast pocket. Mr. Vane has produced another note found, this time in his study. Same hand, same initials. A nice little line about returning for the rest. And he leaned closer, enjoying himself. We've had a gentleman come forward who swears he saw Holmes himself near Ainsley Gardens at 1:15. A gentleman, I repeated. What gentleman? Lestrade shrugged. A chemist clerk from Oxford Street. Respectable fellow. No reason to lie. My stomach turned. Holmes had noticed that clerk. Holmes had known. Our enemy had begun. Laying witnesses as a man lays paving stones. I must see Mr. Vane, I said. Lestrade's smile sharpened. You may, he replied, as a doctor, if he's taken ill. But you'll not take messages to Holmes. Not now. I pushed past him and found Vane in a small room with bars at the window. His fine coat creased, his eyes blazing with humiliation. He sprang up at the sight of me. Dr. Watson, he cried, where is Holmes? Tell me he has found them. Tell me he has stopped this. I took his hands, feeling the tremor in them. Mr. Vane, I said, think carefully. Those letters were they've written to you from within London, yes, years ago. Why? By whom? I asked softly, his face contorted. I cannot, you must, I said. For if your thief is not a common blackmailer, then your silence is his weapon. Vane swallowed, his pride battling his terror. They were from Lady Hester Carroway, he whispered at last. Before her marriage, before everything, Carroway. The name struck me like a blow. Lady Hester was known in society, and her husband, Sir Basil Carroway, was known in Parliament. A man with a reputation for moral thunder, and a private temper said to be cruel. Has Sir Basil learned of them? I asked. Vane shook his head violently. No, no. If he did, I repeated, he would do anything to recover them. Vane stared at me, and in his eyes I saw the whole dreadful arithmetic. You think he thinks I think, I said, that someone has promised something to someone, and that the promise has become a snare. Outside the station, in the raw afternoon light, I felt the city closing in like a fist. Holmes was somewhere in Clerkenwell, playing his own dangerous part. Lestrade was here, swelling with certainty. Vane's scandal was already bait for the newspapers. And behind it all moved that invisible man-apothecary chemist, instrument-maker's client who could manufacture not merely handwriting, but witnesses, not merely theft, but disgrace. When at last I returned to Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson met me with terror in her face. Doctor, she whispered, there's been a gentleman here rasking after Mr. Holmes. He left this. She pressed into my hand a fresh envelope of thick cream paper. No stamp, no postmark. 2 words upon it, written in that hated, familiar hand. Dr. John H. Watson. My fingers went numb. Holmes had said the case was a fuse. I saw now that I was the match. Mrs. Hudson's hand still trembled upon the knob of the sitting-room door, as I stood in the passage with that second envelope between my fingers. The paper was thick, the color the same expensive cream, and the writing God help me had that brisk, decisive character which my eye had learned to dread. It was addressed to me with a precision that made the blood retreat from my face. I did not open it at once. I carried it upstairs as one carries a loaded pistol, and when I entered our rooms, I found them empty. The coal in the grate had sunk to a dull red. Holmes's papers lay as he had left them, spread in ordered disarray, and upon the table beside them was his tobacco pouch, untouched. The air of absence in those rooms was always peculiarly intense, for Holmes, when present, seemed to fill them with the mere vibration of his thought. Now, with him gone into the fog and danger of Clerkenwell, The familiar sitting room appeared suddenly like a stage after the actor has departed, props remaining. Life withdrawn. I sat at the table and slit the envelope with my knife. There was no flourish, no seal, nothing that might betray a crest or a hand accustomed to ceremony. Within lay a single sheet, folded once. My dear Watson, you have discovered, I trust, that loyalty is a language easily exploited. You hesitated when you should have spoken. You lied when you should have trusted. And by doing so, you have proven yourself the perfect instrument. Do not be ashamed. Instruments do not choose the hand that plays them. At 6 o'clock this evening, you will walk alone to St. Bartholomew's Hospital and wait beneath the North Arch, where the stones are blackened by the city's breath. You will carry with you the second letter, the one addressed to you, and you will give it to the first man who says the word music room. If you refuse, Mr. Julian Vane will learn, by messenger and by print, the name of the lady whose letters he keeps like relics. If you attempt to involve the police, Inspector Lestrade will be provided with proof that Sherlock Holmes broke into a gentleman's house and stole correspondence of a treasonable character. If you warn Holmes, you will watch him destroyed by his own efforts to save you. You will do as you are told, because you are a good man and because good men are the easiest to direct. SH4. A moment my eyes clung to the last initials as though they might transform under my gaze into some other shape. It was the same insult repeated. Holmes's own hand made to damn him. Holmes's own manner made to sneer at. But there was a difference in this letter, and it struck me with the force of a cold drafted addressed not my trust in Holmes, but my guilt. Whoever wrote it knew I had lied. If not the exact words, then the fact of evasion. And that knowledge implied either an ear within Baker Street, a watchful eye in every street we had crossed, or most appalling of all, access to Holmes's movements and speech so intimate that it could only come from one of our own circle. I found myself looking at Mrs. Hudson's closed door with a sense of shame, then forcing the thought away as unjust. There was another explanation, one less personal and more sinister. The writer did not need to know what had passed between Holmes and me. He needed only to understand the predictable mechanics of friendship under strain. I read the letter again. Slowly, and certain phrases rose like hooks. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, North Arch, music room. These were not the words of a man improvising. They were signposts set into the very stone of London. The trap was no longer aimed only at Holmes's reputation. It had shifted to my using Vane's scandal as the lever, Lestrade's vanity as the fulcrum, and my own conscience as the weight. I rose and paced the room, unable to sit. My first instinct was to run at once to St. Bartholomew's, to do precisely what was demanded, if only to prevent the threatened ruin to Lady Hester and the probable violence which would follow. But to go alone at a set hour to a set place, carrying a letter as bait, this was to step into the open with a target painted upon my chest. My second instinct was to go straight to Lestrade, to fling these letters upon his desk and force him, by the sheer absurdity of their existence, to admit the truth. Yet the writer had calculated that too. Lestrade would not see a trap. He would see an opportunity. He would seize Holmes not because the evidence was sound, but because it was convenient and public. I went to the window and stared down at Baker Street. The fog hung low, softening the edges of the world. Cabs passed like shadows. Somewhere beyond that veil, Holmes was playing his own part, disguised, unseen, drawing nearer to Karl, the instrument maker, and the so-called apothecary. I imagined him in some dingy workshop, his keen eyes on brass and gears, his mind dismantling the mechanism of imitation. And while he did so, his enemy had turned to me, confident that the warm heart in our partnership would beat obediently to any rhythm of blackmail. At 5:30, I made my decision. I would go to St. Bartholomew's, but I would not go as the Obedient pawn, the letter demanded, nor would I go without preparation. I took my revolver, checked the chambers, and placed it in my pocket. I wrote a note to Holmes brief, urgent, without explanations that might be intercepted on. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I burned it in the grate. If the writer truly watched every message, then a note left behind was merely another rope to hang Holmes with. Instead, I did the only thing left to me. I trusted Holmes's mind to find me when I placed myself where the enemy expected. I carried the letter addressed to me in my inside pocket. The irony of it almost made me laugh. A letter written in Holmes's hand, ordering me to deliver a letter written in Holmes's hand. To a man who would speak a word taken from a letter written in Holmes's hand. It was a hall of mirrors, and in every reflection I saw only the same calm initials at the end, like a signature stamped upon my fate. The streets were growing darker when I reached Smithfield. The great bulk of St. Bartholomew's rose out of the surrounding squalor with a kind of ancient patience, its stones stained by centuries of smoke and rain. Under the North Arch, the air was colder, and the noise of the city seemed muffled, as if the old hospital drank sound as it drank suffering. I stood there, just within the shadow, my eyes fixed on the flow of passers-by, porters, clerks, a nurse hurrying with a bundle, a group of medical students laughing too loudly. 90 minutes dragged. My hand, in my pocket, rested upon the revolver grip. I felt absurdly exposed, as if every man who glanced my way might be the apothecary in a new coat. Every boy the watcher at the gate, every respectable gentleman and actor hired to speak. Q. At 6:15, a man approached from the direction of the main courtyard. He was of medium height, wrapped in a dark overcoat, his hat brim low. His gait was unremarkable, which was, in itself, remarkable. For men who intend harm so often carry their intention in their shoulders. He came to within a few feet and stopped. For an instant he did not speak. His eyes met mine, and I saw in them not hatred nor greed, but an empty, professional calm. Then, in a voice so low that I barely caught it, he said one word: "Music room." My mouth went dry. The letter in my pocket seemed suddenly to weigh a pound. I forced myself to move my hand towards its hand. In that moment, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadow beyond the arch, limping slightly, one shoulder high. An old beggar's whiskers ragged on his jaw, the beggar's watery eye fixed on the man in the overcoat, and though the disguise was perfect, my heart leaped with recognition. Holmes had found me. He had found me at the exact point where the enemy meant to take me. The man in the overcoat saw the beggar too, and for the first time his composure faltered. His hand twitched towards his own pocket. Holmes's voice, thin, nasal, contemptuous in the beggar's tone, cut through the twilight. "Ah," said he, "you are punctual. How reassuring. Now tell your master that he has made one small miscalculation." The man in the overcoat stepped back sharply, his gaze darting, seeking escape or reinforcement. Holmes did not move quickly. He did not need to. He merely shifted his position so that the man's line of retreat passed directly beneath the arch. And I saw then what I had missed: 2 hospital porters lingering too long at the corner, and a constable whose helmet gleamed faintly in the gaslight. Holmes had turned the trap inside out and stocked it with his own pieces. "Watson," he said without looking at me, "give him nothing. Not the letter, not your fear, nothing." The man in the overcoat made a decision. He sprang forward past me, nodded me his shoulder, slamming into mine. I stumbled, caught myself, and saw his hand flash up with something small and bright. A blade. He meant not to cut me, but to cut past me, to carve a way through the beggar who blocked him. Holmes moved then with sudden, terrible speed. The limp vanished. The beggar's stoop straightened like a released spring. His hand shot out and caught the attacker's wrist. twisting with a precision that made the knife clatter to the stones. The man gave a sharp cry, not of pain, but of shock, as one does when a plan collapses. In the same instant, the porters and the constable were upon him, dragging him back, pinning his arms. Holmes bent, picked up the fallen knife with 2 fingers, and examined it as calmly as if it were a new species of beetle. His eyes lifted to mine. "You see, my dear Watson," he said, and now his own voice bled through the disguise. Cold and certain, he expected you alone. Then, in the struggling man's pocket, the constable found a folded slip of cream paper. The attacker's eyes widened as it was drawn out, and for the first time he looked truly afraid, not of arrest, but of what the paper represented. Holmes took it, opened it, and gave the faintest smile. It was another note in Holmes's handwriting, and beneath it, scrawled in a hand that was not Holmes's hurried, sharp, desperate word, 2 words that made my blood turn to ice. Caraway. Midnight. Midnight drew on with that peculiar hush which sometimes falls upon London, when the fog thickens and even the most restless streets seem to hold their breath. Holmes had dismissed the constable and the hospital porters with a few rapid words, and the captured messenger, now sullen, his courage drained away the moment the paper was found upon him, was handed over to official keeping with such concise instructions that even Scotland Yard would find little room to blunder. Yet Holmes himself, having secured this one small piece of the enemy's machinery, showed no disposition to linger over it. The scrawled words, "Caraway, midnight," had done what no threat, no forged signature, no planted key had yet accomplished. They had shifted his whole attention to a new center, a new household, and a new danger which lay not in the past, but in the next few hours. We took a cab at once, and in that brief drive Holmes spoke very little. He sat hunched in his disguise, the beggar's shoulders still high, the watery eye still blinking, and yet I could feel the familiar engine of his mind working with a cold, relentless speed. When I ventured a question whether we were to warn Sir Basil Caraway or to watch his house, Holmes answered only, "We are to arrive before the man who believes we shall arrive too late." That was all. But it was enough to set my nerves on edge, for I knew that when Holmes became thus economical with speech, it was because every surplus word seemed an extravagance in the face of urgency. Caraway's residence lay, in a street of grave, well-kept houses not far from the park, where the iron railings were as black and rigid as the conventions within. We had not the advantage of a friendly invitation. Indeed, it was plain that any overt approach would invite precisely the commotion our adversary desired. Servants wakened, doors thrown open, a respectable gentleman scandalized, and the police. Lestrade could be stirred arriving with their minds already poisoned against Holmes. Holmes therefore chose the quiet way, the professional way, and, I confess, the way that made my heart beat a little faster as we left the cab at a distance, and walked the remainder on foot through the fog. A single lamp burned at the corner, its light smeared into a yellow halo. Holmes paused under it long enough to glance at the soot upon the glass and the direction of the wind, as if even the night air must be consulted. Then he drew me into the shadow of a doorway opposite Caraway's house. "Observe," he murmured. At first I saw nothing but the blank facade, curtained windows, a respectable fanlight, a line of steps. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I perceived a detail that set my skin crawling. One upstairs curtain was not fully drawn. There was a finger's width of darkness between fabric and frame, as if someone within had been watching and had not dared to watch too openly. "Lady Hester," I whispered. Holmes's answer was a soft exhalation. "Or a servant placed there, or the very man who wishes you to think of Lady Hester. Our opponent does not merely frame, he composes." We waited. Minutes passed with that dreadful slowness which accompanies any vigil where action is expected and yet must not be forced. A policeman's tread sounded once at the far end of the street and faded. A cab rolled by, wheels muffled in the wet. And then, precisely as the church clock somewhere behind us began to strike the first note of midnight, a figure emerged from the fog and approached the caraway steps. He was not the apothecary. This man walked with the careful anonymity of a professional, cap, low collar turned up, hands tucked as though he were merely cold. Yet he paused one instant at the railings, and in that pause Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. There, he breathed. The right hand? I watched and saw what he meant. The gloved hand lifted briefly, and in the lamplight a faint wet sheen flashed upon the leather near the fingertips, as if the glove had been brushed against something fluid. I recalled Holmes's mention of prussic acid and felt my mouth go dry. A poison so swift would need only a touch upon a handle, a latch. A glass remedy commonplace point of contact. The man mounted the steps. He produced a key. Holmes did not move like a man who rushes. He moved like a man who has been waiting his whole life for the precise moment when movement is inevitable. In 2 strides he was across the street. In 3 more he was at the foot of the steps. His disguise fell away in action, not in appearance, but in force. The beggar's stoop could not hide the sudden precision of his limbs. I followed, revolver drawn but held low, for the street was still, and a shot would have been a declaration to all London. Holmes sprang, caught the man from behind, and drove him hard against the railings. The key flew, clinked, and vanished into the area below. The stranger twisted with surprising strength, trying to bring his right hand round. But Holmes seized that wrist with such exact pressure that the man's fingers opened involuntarily. Something small dropped, no larger than a cigar holder, dark and gleaming. "A glass applicator," said Holmes, breath quick now, eyes alight. "Watson, do not touch it." The man snarled and flung his head back, striking Holmes's cheekbone. Holmes did not loosen his grip. He drove the fellow down upon the steps, pinning him. I moved in, caught the man's other arm, and between us we held him as firmly as we had held Afghans in the dark when it was life or death and no third option. From above, the door opened a fraction. A woman's voice, tight with terror, spoke into the gap. Basil Holmes did not look up. "Lady Hester," he said clearly, "do not come out. Lock your door. Wake the servants. And if Sir Basil is in the house, keep him away from this entrance." There was a sharp intake of breath, and the door shut at once. Our captive ceased struggling, not from surrender, but from calculation. "Too late," he hissed. "It's already done." Holmes's face, even in the dim light, was like carved stone. "Not yet," he said. And for a moment I heard in his voice something colder than anger and absolute certainty that the ignoovers could still be compelled to make sense. He released a man's wrist only long enough to pull a handkerchief from his pocket and wrap it around the dropped instrument. Then, with the careful disgust of a chemist handling contagion, he lifted it and examined the tip. "Almond," he murmured. "Bitter almond and something else, oil, perhaps, to make it cling. A practical touch." "Holmes," I urged. "What? Has he poisoned?" Holmes's gaze went to the door handle, then to the rail, then to the area gate, then very suddenly to the brass knocker. "The knocker," he said, and his tone changed. He intended the household to open to a caller, a late message, a panic, a policeman, a friend, anyone. The first hand to lift it receives his greeting. The man laughed, low and ugly. "And the story will still be Holmes," he breathed. "Holmes at the steps at midnight. Holmes wrestling in the street. Holmes weighs Holmes. Holmes leaned closer. 'Who is your master?' he asked softly. 'The apothecary? Or the man behind him?' The fellow's eyes glittered. 'You'll never prove it,' he said. 'That's the art.' Holmes's smile, when it came, was terrible in its calm. "Art," said he, "requires an audience. You have given yourself." One footstep sounded behind, is hurried, multiple. A side door across the street opened, and a stout man in a nightcoat appeared with a lantern, followed by two servants. They had been roused by the commotion, and now stared, wide-eyed, at the sight of Sherlock Holmes pinning a stranger on Sir Basil Carroway's steps. I saw at once the peril of it. Here was the very tableau our enemy desired Holmes in a struggle at midnight before an aristocrat's door. And Lestrade would have his warrant by dawn. Holmes rose in one smooth movement, hauling the captive with him by the collar. He addressed the lantern-bearer with brisk authority. "You," said he, "run to the nearest constable and say there is an attempted poisoning at Sir Basil Carroway's. Tell him to bring a surgeon and to keep every hand from that, until I have shown him where the danger lies. Go." The man hesitated only an instant. Holmes's manner admits no prolonged doubt, and then hurried off. Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said, "the poison is the lesser danger. The greater is the narrative. We must ensure the first official record is truth, not theater." "And how do we do that?" I asked. Holmes's eyes flashed towards the fog-choked corner where our cab had waited. "We take our prisoner," said he, "to the one place in London where words are weighed before they are repeated. Mycroft?" Holmes's mouth tightened. "Mycroft," he confirmed. "And then, before dawn, we visit Carl and Clockenwell not as bait, but as executioner. Our apothecary has played with my handwriting long enough. Now he shall learn what it is to be written into a case by Sherlock Holmes." He gave the struggling man a short, sharp shake. "You wished to place my hand upon a murder," he said. "Instead, you have placed your own upon the evidence." And with that we moved off into the fog, Holmes walking with his prisoner as calmly as if he had just concluded a pleasant consultation, while I followed with my revolver hidden and my heart hammering, knowing that the next hours would decide whether this manufactured handwriting would end as mere scandalore as the signature upon a death.